It is January 1 of 2015. Happy New Year. We're going to start with our third set of notes on the book of Acts. So we did finally get into the third set here. And we're trying to really get into the substance of things. And we're going to take a look at Acts 2 now. We're really getting into the depth of Acts 2. And we have in Acts 2, 5 through 10, the interrogation of the Pentecost event by the devout Jews that were in Jerusalem at the time for the celebration of Pentecost, which is the 50th day after Passover. And it is the day when they celebrate the giving of the law to Moses on Mount Sinai. So it was the giving of the law celebration. There were many devout Jews in Jerusalem for that occasion. And the Pentecost incident started getting talked about, and a group of witnesses, or a group of devout Jews, showed up at the upper room and wanted to interrogate the situation and see what was going on firsthand. So the first interrogation was the question, how? In verse 5, these devout Jews were there for the celebration of the giving of the law, but the word got out about Pentecost. There was the ginomai phone, or the sound of the event being spread out through Jerusalem. So Pentecost actually came into being as somewhat of a historical event that got talked about, and it drew a crowd of witnesses. Now, when these Jews investigated the event, they were, according to Luke, they were confounded, and the word here means thrown into confusion by this spill of language in different tongues. So the spill of language in different dialects caused these witnesses, these investigators, to be confounded about what was going on. And a great word, existeme, that is used here by Luke, has a great description. It says that they were out of balance. I like that. They were out of balance intellectually. They were out of balance cognitively. They had been thrown into a shock that caused them to be out of balance in an intellectual way. They couldn't understand what was going on. They were astonished beyond the senses. So the question of how comes up, and it is basically, how are they hearing this dialect or these languages in their own specific dialect? How is a normal hearing turning into hupakuo, hyperhearing, or, as translated in English, spiritual hearing? There was a miracle of spiritual hearing going on here, because every individual devout Jew was hearing the language, the dialect of their own particular birth dialect. So they were being very specifically and individually addressed, and that's something they could not understand. Number one, how come they're being addressed individually in their own individual dialect? It's something completely contrary to the corporate idea of Israel and the corporate idea of salvation. Now they're getting addressed individually. They don't understand it, and they're experiencing spiritual hearing instead of just normal hearing. Now the question as to what, the second interrogation, is interesting, because the word megaleios means greatly magnified. So what's great here is that after the ascension, to the right hand of God of authority for Christ and the outpouring of the Spirit, the content of what is being spoken about is the actions of God, but these actions of God, or actions of the Messiah, are now magnified because everything Jesus did before as Messiah now gets magnified because it is now interpreted as Jesus, the Messiah, as Kyrios, Lord. So it's a magnification from Christos to Kyrios, a magnification of acts of the Messiah to acts of the Lord, seated in the place of authority at the right hand of God. So we have the question of the how is this being addressed to me individually and specifically instead of the corporate Israel. We've got the what, the content of a magnified content being magnified to the level of a lordship. And so, obviously, the question that they come up with as witnesses is what does this mean? They come up with the question of intentionality. So what in the world does this mean? What's the intention behind all of this? And it's really fantastic because the individual who answers this is Peter, who does not lack boldness, because Peter is going to get up and speak to this, and he says, actually, this is all referenced in Joel 2. So he goes back to the prophet Joel and Joel 2, 28 through 32, and he says that this is the outpouring of the Spirit that was promised at the coming of the day of the Lord. So obviously, if we're experiencing this outpouring of the Spirit, the day of the coming of the Lord must have occurred. And that occurred, according to Peter, in the ascension of Jesus as the Christos to the right hand of authority as Kyrios, lordship. And so the day of the Lord in Joel 2 has been met in the ascension of Christ to the right hand of the Lord, to the place of authority. So the Christos has become Kyrios, and the Joel prophecy has been fulfilled, and it's been validated and verified in the outpouring of the Spirit. So Peter does not hesitate. He says, Joel 2, 28 through 32 says this is the coming of the day of the Lord. You are experiencing the coming of the day of the Lord in this experience. So it goes on in verses 2:17 to 21 to say that there are 6 outward expressions of this event. There is, and based on the Old Testament prophecy, there is prophecy, there's visions, there's dreams, and very importantly, there are signs, outward signs that are being expressed. And all of this is the coming day of the Lord as an epiphany of light from the heavens. The coming of the day of the Lord is described as an epiphany of light from the heavens. So this is an experience of an epiphany in a way, but it's a shared epiphany. It's shared by multiple witnesses, each being addressed individually, but it is an epiphany. The day of the Lord is described as an epiphany of light. And light, of course, is an unveiling and the revelation of truth. So, according to Peter, salvation has come in the name of the Lord. Salvation has arrived in the day of the Lord, and the day of the Lord is validated in this outpouring of the Spirit, which is an epiphany of light from the heavens. And so Peter, being very bold here, because we know that in Jerusalem the synagogues were tolerated by the emperor cult, but Christianity was considered a sect, and it was not tolerated by the emperor cult. They, at the very, very best, they could hope for maybe a little bit of sympathy if they were mistakenly aligned with Judaism or the synagogue. But basically, Peter's in a dangerous step here. He's actually speaking out in a dangerous situation. But the Lord had to remain in Jerusalem, so they did remain in spite of the possible threats. And not only did they remain, but Peter is getting up and speaking boldly. So the next section of 2:22 through 28 is Peter validating the title of Son of Man to Jesus of Nazareth. It's the assignment of the title, Son of Man to Jesus of Nazareth. And the title of Son of Man is that title that Joel 2 spoke of. And now he's going to formally assign it to Jesus of Nazareth. And he begins with a Son of Man crucified in verses 22 and 23. And he says that this Son of Man was shown forth from God himself, and that Christ did reveal miracles, but miracles is really the word dunamis. In other words, Christ did display divine power. He did display wonders, and he did present signs. We know that. His teaching was teaching in signs, teaching in parables, but he also showed signs. And then the beautiful statement in verse 23, Peter says, and this ministry of Jesus of Nazareth was a presentation of the horizo of God's plan of salvation. It was the detailing and the marking out of God's plan of salvation. Christ was the marking out of this plan of salvation in his life, his teachings, his death, and his resurrection. And so the intentionality behind this event is an intentionality that evolves out of recognizing Jesus of Nazareth as the Son of Man. And then Peter doesn't hold back, but he says, and you delivered him to be crucified. You, devout Jews, delivered this same Jesus to be crucified. Ekdatos, in other words, you surrendered him over to Roman authority to be executed and crucified. Now in verse 24 he goes on to say that this crucified one, as the Son of Man, was resurrected and verified as the Christos, Messiah, and Son of Man. So in verse 24, God raised him up, appointed him to stand out of death itself. The binding of death was broken apart. Luo, which is the primary word for to break apart. Death was broken apart in this instance for Christ, and the snare of death was overcome, and Jesus was raised up out of death itself. And Peter uses the word krateo to say that this authority has been designated by God to never be taken away, to never deteriorate. He is in the place of authority. It is validated and verified in the resurrection. And then Peter goes on to say, and now I gave you the Joel reference. Now I'm going to talk to you about further prophecy in David, and he says that verses 25 through 28, that the Lord was foreseen to be raised up to this place of authority, and he is at the right hand of God, metaphorically, meaning he's appointed to the place of authority as rule and lordship, and this authority is never to be driven away. There's the term saleuo. Saleuo. Saleuo is the term. So he uses the term saleuo to say that this authority can never be driven away. Therefore, now the flesh of humanity, the sarx, can rest in hope. And that rest in hope is very interesting because it uses Now this is a major point here that Luke is making, because when he talks about that now, because of Christ being elevated to Son of Man and exalted to Lordship, he says that the flesh, the sarx, or finitude, can rest in hope, but that rest in hope literally means that we can rest in a spiritual temple of hope. The word in the Greek means spiritual temple of hope. That's important because the Jewish people were waiting for the reinstatement and the raising up of the temple, and Luke uses the Greek term for spiritual temple, the synagogue, and he says that we rest in Christ in this new spiritual temple that's been created through Christ that gives the sarx and finitude true hope. And then he goes on to say in 27 that rescues us from corruption. And what's beautiful here is that the word is as an en kata lipo, and it means abandonment. And this is so central to the gospel, because what Luke is saying is that the ministry of Christ, the crucifixion of Christ, a crucifixion that was what? My God, why hast thou forsaken me? A crucifixion where Christ suffered abandonment. Well, through the resurrection, we now have the promise of the negation of that abandonment. We have victory over abandonment and the promise that humanity will never be abandoned by God through Christ. So a very powerful promise there. And so Peter concludes this talk with the promise of God's presence, which shall be a rejoicing in one's hodos, or journey of life. Our journey of life will be one of being accompanied with a God with us, and we have a God with us because abandonment has been overcome finally and permanently in a Christ who suffered abandonment. So we go in this section of 2:22 to 2:28 from Son of Man crucified through Son of Man resurrected to Son of Man prophesied as the lordship that overcomes abandonment. So extremely powerful information given to us here by Luke concerning the boldness of Peter to speak up in a very dangerous environment, but the Lord had instructed them to remain in Jerusalem, even though it was a dangerous environment. And Peter even stands up and speaks boldly, so thank God for that. So that gives us our third set of notes. That takes us up through Acts 2, the final section, Acts 2:20 through 28.